Just a little bit later on. Alan Mendoza, what do we have to fight to preserve here?
Well, I think we want to preserve much of what we already have.
Such as?
Well, look, we've got a rules-based order. Now, those rules-based, that rules-based order is set up by some of the institutions you mentioned. It's managed in that way. It doesn't mean that they can't be improved. It doesn't mean that some are not fit for purpose. But in general terms, what we have in the world today is an understanding of generally what is right and what is wrong, how nations can come together to improve situations, whether those are through those institutions or acting independently with one another, bilaterally or multilaterally, in that kind of approach.
Are we still beacons of democracy in the West?
We certainly are still beacons of democracy in the West, very much so. And those beacons still shine brightly. However, I think Mary said something very interesting. She pointed out the interregnum of the 1930s. What was significant about that was the loss of confidence in, at the time, what was then the West, in its ability to shape the world and to act.
Well, the League of Nations was absolutely spineless, wasn't it? And ineffective and useless. Isn't there a parallel now with the United Nations?
The United Nations is a grade up from the League of Nations, but only a grade up from the League of Nations. There is a fundamental problem, if you're going to talk about the United Nations, in that with 5 veto-bearing countries, very little can get done apart from the lowest common denominator aspect. You've got, of course, individual agencies that do quite a bit. The ILO, health, you've got different things doing that, but the organisation as a whole is hamstrung by that strategy, which means that, for example, the Russians can go ahead and veto any kind of questions about what they're doing in the world. And contrary again to what Mary said about, say, wars, the Russians have done pretty conventional wars in Crimea, Georgia, other factors. That's not gone yet, I'm afraid, the sort of old style of war. And as a result, you don't get any unanimity on the international stage.
Let me take you back to beacons of democracy.
Well, David, you're right.
Our modern order is kind of based on that. That's what Thatcher was encouraging
David,
us
you're
to do.
right. But society has already shown in Western countries that it responds to things like that. And the things that have been mentioned today, I can't see why within our liberal democracies we wouldn't address that. For example, at the end of the... Hang on, let me finish my point. At the end of the 19th century, there was a lot of concern about poverty within Western societies, within what was happening because of capitalism, because of the factories, people's life expectancy, things like that. What happened? The development of the welfare state started to emerge. People recognised we couldn't just be looking at ourselves, we had to look at those less fortunate. As a result, almost every Western country over a period of time put together, within its liberal democracies, institutions that would cater for those who were less able to fend for themselves in those societies. So I don't believe we can necessarily say that we're going to fail again. I think actually the past shows we can succeed again.
But I
if
mean,
we choose to.
Maya, pick up that thought.
Forms of foreign policy that it has.
This is a daft argument. I'm sorry, I'll tell you why it's daft. Because while we are not perfect in human rights, you're absolutely correct. You can point to many things about our lack of perfection. If you look at the global league table of human rights, the amount of energy expended on that, for example, as opposed to those living in general misery under threat of torture in other countries around the world.
An atheist in Bangladesh.
And if I may say the other thing on that, I'm just going to finish, hold on. What's interesting is when you speak to dissidents, people who have railed against authoritarian regimes around the world, as I do quite a lot, I speak to opposition movements, the one thing they say is exactly what that gentleman over there said, the political freedoms are what we are fighting for. I'll give you a case in point. Natan Sharansky, when he was a prisoner of the Soviet Union, when he wrote The Case for Democracy, read his book, fascinating argument about why democracy is a superior model. He said, for me and others like me, who were imprisoned by this evil regime that took away our human rights, what kept us going, firstly, was the idea that there was a better system at the end of the tunnel that we could force, but secondly, that people in the West were campaigning for little old me and people like me who they'd never heard of, but they were standing up for my human rights against that mighty machine. And that, I think, is something that's so important to remember. Yes, we have problems sometimes with our own human rights, but compared to the rest of the world, we are indeed the gold standard.
But this is a fundamental problem with this debate, is this kind of comparison. No one is suggesting that human rights abuses in other countries aren't incredibly important and we shouldn't be talking about those. All I'm merely saying is the fact that people in Yemen right now who are being bombed, who are starving because of Saudi the support that Saudi Arabia gets from Britain, you go and talk to them and ask them how great Britain's human rights are. To suggest that it's not as important because it's not as bad as some other places really is a massive flaw in this kind of argument.
I'm saying that you are on the debate like this, when it comes to human rights, you're simply getting on your soapbox and shouting at something you can control rather than something you ought to want to control, which is the people who are attacking Yemen in the first place. That issue alone. That's what's happening.
Theo, let me bring you in on Yemen, because I know it's something you've considered in...
I think there's confidence, but there's also a confidence issue. It comes back to what I said at the start about the 1930s and the lack of confidence in the West that allowed others to overturn systems and to come in and give radical solutions. I think we have a crisis of confidence among our political leaderships about their ability to get things done. I think it's interesting, you highlighted Michael Gove just now. On the environment, he's making big steps. Maybe not big enough, but they are big steps compared to what you've seen in the past. He's got the confidence, clearly, to put them through. And I'll argue again on Mary's point. She's absolutely right. In the 1990s, you saw all this approach to human rights, a very sort of prominent, we must make it a centrepiece of what we were doing. The reason we were so confident was we'd just won the Cold War. We'd won the Cold War, it looked like the future was going to be our kind of future, and we wanted to campaign for that. What then happened on this issue was that the Iraq War occurred, and we all know the hangover, the spillover of the Iraq War has been that nobody feels able to advocate any kind of interventionism of any sort because it's all sort of thrown into the Iraq handle. As a result, human rights become secondary because everyone goes Iraq, Iraq,
So the
Iraq.
UN is redundant, as they use that phrase. It's not fit for purpose anymore.
Well, as I said earlier, the individual agencies do very good work, but on a sort of international level, it has huge problems because it cannot do more than the lowest common denominator. But I think there's a point before this whole Brexit debate. We don't want to have yet another Brexit debate. There have been so many.
But it does fall into the context of the world.
But this is why I want to bring it up.
On the liberal world order.
But it comes down to essentially the failure of the European Union and those who supported the European Union and its value and everything in that way to make a case conducive for the European Union to the people of this country. And it's happening in other places. Look at the mess in Italy. How can you have an election?
Is the
How can you
European
have an
Union?
election
It's the
in a
Council of
country
Ministers
in a
and
country
the
in
European-
Europe where a majority of people vote a certain way, and the president with the stroke of his pen says you can't have that government, basically because he's worried about the anti-Euro guy who's going to be the finance minister. And this is extraordinary. If the European Union and those who support it in each country cannot get the message across about why they are there and why that is a benefit to ordinary people, why would people vote for them?
Who is the European Union? It's the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament. We are part of the Council of Ministers. We vote our MEPs into the European Parliament. It is our responsibility that we chose not to care about European elections and put people like Nigel Farage into the European Parliament. We have our own commissioners. We had the High Representative was British. What's all this about the European Union, us being some other and not us?
I wasn't saying that. I was saying it's a case of the failure to make the case. And that's clear. Our politicians who are backing the Remain argument came up with a losing strategy.
It's stop the liberal world order, I want to get off. It's a bit of that.
That was one message, and the country message was, oh, a bit embarrassed. Actually, yes, the European Union isn't great, by the way. We can kind of improve it a little bit, but you're fundamentally right. There's problems. We're going to change it in that way. Had there been a positive approach, as we saw, for example, in the Scottish referendum, when the union case wasn't put forward kind of negatively but positively as being better for all of us, basically, you can see the reaction to that. You can't possibly say that British people made a bad choice, because on the choice of the two campaigns, they made a good choice.
Linda, what about the future for people who feel